We like to think that as individuals we're open-minded, but are we? On the evening of May 29, 1913, the Parisian upper crust gathered for a night of music and dance. Tonight, it was the premiere of the Rite of Spring by composer Igor Stravinsky. And although it was already special enough to get dressed up in your finest and go to the theater for a dose of performing arts, this particular show brought about an extra bit of thrill and curiosity to the evening. The performance caused a legendary scandal when the unconventional choreography and music shocked the audience. Opening night. But why such a big deal on opening night? There is some disagreement among historians and witnesses about the exact events of the premiere of the Rite of Spring, but it is generally agreed that the performance caused some kind of riot, maybe literally or just socially. Some accounts describe the audience as booing and jeering, and others describe the reaction as more of a stunned silence or murmuring, like talking shit. People threw vegetables and other random things at the stage, which, do people really bring vegetables to the theater? Where do they get them? Do they buy them there? Some people got into a fist fight, allegedly. Others were thrown out, some arrested, but that can never truly be known because the police records were conveniently missing. The rich snobs in the crowd were outraged by this work from a madman, while the bohemian snobs wanted to cheer and rage even harder in support and out of spite. In attendance were notable figures like composer Erik Satie, the painters Pablo Picasso and Jean Cocteau, and the writer Jean Hugo. Many influencers of the time, like critics and musicians, were also there, making the premiere one of the most highly anticipated and cultural events of the year. Their presence and the fact that it all took place in Paris helped to ensure that the Rite of Spring would be widely talked about for a long time. The music. On opening night, the audience was simply unprepared for the revolutionary music and avant-garde choreography. The unconventional rhythms and dissonant harmonies of Stravinsky's score clashed with Nijinsky's daring and primitive choreography, but in a good way. People couldn't handle how new and different this was. It all just smacked everyone right in the face with its originality. People were overwhelmed. The rhythms were highly complex and often irregular, the harmonies were dissonant, and the orchestration was massive. There were unusual instruments such as the bassoon, the bass clarinet, the contrabassoon. The music was just highly percussive and featured driving, repetitive rhythms that were new to many listeners at the time. All of these elements combined to create a sound that was entirely different from anything that people had ever heard before. Imagine using a time machine and taking techno back to Mozart and his circle of friends. It would blow their minds. Although on second thought, I kind of think that Mozart would fuck with techno. I don't know, it's a feeling. But that's not the point. The point is that it would be so different from anything that they'd ever heard before that they might have a hard time processing it, understandably. Human culture as a whole tends to have a natural progression at a pace us humans can deal with. Big and small events happen throughout our history, marks are left in the collective psyche, it influences styles, one movement leads to another movement and so on, and there's usually enough contextual reference material within one generation to allow for a manageable flow into the next cultural wave. So while things still feel new, there's this natural progression, but nature also has outliers. And like Stravinsky, the universe contains those events, those forces of nature that are so eccentric, so unexpected and out of left field that they really shake up the environment. The audience at the opening night of Rite of Spring had no prior exposure for what they were about to take in. Their human brains were overwhelmed by the new stimuli that didn't lend itself to easy and familiar pattern making. It didn't provide any relief, and so they freaked out. If you've never heard the Rite of Spring in its entirety, I recommend you look it up and take a listen. Like, after you finish watching my video, of course. You'll probably recognize what I'm talking about when I said complex and irregular harmonies and dissonance. But to our 21st century ears, it's likely not to sound that crazy, but rather something like a dramatic film score. And that's because we have exposure to those styles. Rite of Spring has influenced many and trickled down into countless works of art. It's become normalized. But don't you ever wonder what kind of music will come out of the 2120s? Makes you think. The ballet. The ballet portion of the Rite of Spring was choreographed by Václav Nijinsky. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. A leading dancer of the ballet Russes. Nijinsky's choreography was as unconventional as Stravinsky's music, and was intended to depict a pagan ritual celebrating the arrival of spring. The dancers used sharp and angular movements and bold primitive gestures to express the primal energy of the renewal ritual. The stage was filled with an ensemble of dancers, performing highly stylized rhythmic movements in unison. And the choreography was like was unlike anything that had been seen before. The seemingly wild music and Nijinsky's innovative choreography, it made it a revolutionary work that challenged traditional ideas about ballet and music. This ballet was no longer just about it looking pretty. As the Rite of Spring story goes, a community gathers to perform a ritual in which a young girl is chosen to dance herself to death, symbolizing the sacrifice necessary for the renewal of the earth and the arrival of spring. The piece is divided into two parts: the adoration of the earth and the sacrificial dance. And the adoration of the earth section opens with a slow and mysterious introduction, gradually building in intensity as the community gathers to perform the ritual. And the sacrificial dance is the climax of the piece. It depicts the chosen girl dancing herself to death. The music in this section is even more percussive and frenzied than it is in the first part. There's a relentless, driving beat that propels the dancers to ever greater heights of physical exertion. And the visual design of the whole thing is equally as striking. The costumes, the set, the lighting, it all contributed to the primitive and elemental feel of the ritual. It was dramatic. So when you look up The Rite of Spring, I highly suggest you check out the version with the ballet and get a full vibe of the thing. The Russian element. It's worth noting the Russian element to all of this. Parisian attitudes toward Russian artists and performers in the early 20th century were complex and varied. Hot, cold, love, hate. On one hand, there was a great deal of interest and appreciation for Russian culture, particularly in the realm of ballet, where the Ballet Russes, a company made up of Russian dancers and choreographers, was highly regarded for their amazing technical skill. Paris was also home to a large community of Russian expatriates and immigrants, many of whom were artists and intellectuals, so they were appreciated. On the other hand, there was also a degree of cultural chauvinism and suspicion toward anything perceived as foreign, especially from Russia, which was seen as a less developed and less sophisticated country. This negative attitude was compounded by political tensions between France and Russia, which were competing for influence on the world stage, and among other pressures of the early 20th century, as if there weren't enough. But despite these tensions, Paris remained a hub of cultural exchange and was generally receptive to new and innovative forms of art, which made it an ideal place to host the premiere of such a new kind of work. But as open-minded as Parisians were, there was definitely an element of us versus them when it came to Russian artists, which had to have stoked the flames of the freak-out reaction that night. So was it a success back in its day? While the majority of the audience at the Rite of Spring was shocked and disturbed, the audience was still polarized between horrified and entranced. There were some people who appreciated the groundbreaking nature of the work. The avant-garde circles of Paris, including influential composers, artists, writers, blah blah blah, all of them, they were all fascinated by the innovative aspects of the piece, and they saw it as a landmark in the development of modern art. And some influential critics praised the work and helped it to become the cultural sensation that it is today. This work belonged right where it was born, in the politically tumultuous and creatively effervescent time that was the early 20th century. This work belonged right where it was born, in the politically tumultuous and creatively effervescent time that was the early 20th century. In the years following its premiere, The Rite of Spring continued to be performed and was embraced by many. Today, it's widely considered an important piece of 20th century classical music and is performed and recorded by orchestras and ballets around the world. And although it was not immediately recognized as a success, the longevity and continued popularity of The Rite of Spring is proof of its lasting impact and influence on the arts. I mean, come on, Disney animated a film just for it. You ever watch Fantasia? I think this story illustrates the human propensity for aversion to sudden change. We like to think we're open-minded, but are we? And throughout art, human history, and of course our current era, we have proven that we really don't like drastic change. It freaks people out, even if it's good for us. A simple evolutionary survival mechanism, I'm sure. Thank you so much for watching. If you find these moments and stories in history as interesting as I do, I would deeply appreciate it if you would hit that like button and subscribe for more art-related content. And until next time, take care and be nice to yourself.